For billion years ago it rained. Not the kind of rain you know. Not the gentle spring rain that darkens the pavement and fills the gutters and makes the air smell of earth. This was something else entirely. This was a rain that had been building for millions of years. Steam and water vapor trapped in a thick, crushing atmosphere of carbon dioxide and nitrogen and sulfur dioxide, slowly cooling as the planet beneath it lost heat, condensing into drops, falling toward a surface that was, for the first time in Earth's violent history, cool enough to receive them. It rained for a very long time. Thousands of years perhaps. Tens of thousands. A rain so sustained, so relentless, so total in its coverage of the entire planet, that when it finally slowed, the world looked different. Where there had been bare black volcanic rock-encrusted magma and the desolate aftermath of 400 million years of planetary violence, there was now something that had never existed before. Not on this world, and as far as we know, not anywhere else in the known universe at that moment. Water. Standing liquid, permanent water. An ocean. The first ocean. And that ocean, that thin, dark, acidic, lifeless, utterly uninhabitable by any modern standard, changed everything. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Not in any way that a hypothetical observer could have pointed to and said, "There, that is the moment." But in ways that would compound over hundreds of millions of years, building on each other, each consequence generating the next, until the cumulative result was something so improbable that we are still, today, struggling to understand how it happened. Life. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the ocean could change everything, it first had to exist. And the story of how it came to exist is, in itself, one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of this planet. In the last episode, we left Earth in the immediate aftermath of the Theia impact. A world reshaped by the most violent collision in its history, spinning fast, tilted at 23.5 degrees, with a newly formed moon hanging enormous and close in a sky full of toxic gas. The surface was largely remelted. The atmosphere was a crushing, opaque blanket of steam and volcanic outgassing. There was no liquid water anywhere on the planet's surface. To get from that world to a world with permanent oceans requires two things: cooling and water. The cooling came first, and it came from the nature of the Hadean Earth's energy budget. The planet was losing heat through radiation into space faster than it was gaining heat from radioactive decay and the residual warmth of accretion. This is a slow process. The interior of the planet remained ferociously hot, and volcanic activity continued at a scale that dwarfs anything in the modern world. But the surface, exposed to the cold of space, gradually lost enough energy to begin solidifying. The magma ocean crystallized from the top down and from the edges in. First thin, fragile plates of solid rock formed on the surface, only to be broken and remelted by the convection currents churning beneath them. Then thicker, more persistent slabs. Then, over millions of years, a genuine crust, thin and geologically unstable by modern standards, but real. As the surface cooled, the temperature dropped below a critical threshold. 374 degrees Celsius, the critical point of water. Above this temperature, water cannot exist as a liquid regardless of pressure. Below it, under sufficient pressure, liquid water becomes possible. When the surface temperature dropped below this point, the enormous quantities of water vapor that had been locked in the atmosphere began to condense. And it began to rain. The rain was not pure water. It was acidic. Loaded with dissolved carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volcanic gases that had accumulated in the atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years. It fell onto bare volcanic rock, primarily basalt, the dark, fine-grained rock that forms when lava cools quickly. The rain dissolved minerals from that rock as it flowed across the surface and collected in low points. The first proto-oceans were not clear and blue. They were dark, mineral-laden, acidic, warm, and completely lifeless. But they were liquid water. And liquid water, on a planet with the chemistry that early Earth possessed, is the beginning of everything. Where did Earth's water actually come from? This is one of the most actively debated questions in planetary science, and the answer matters more than it might initially seem. If you understand where Earth's water came from, you understand something fundamental about why Earth is habitable when its neighbors are not. And by extension, something about how common habitable planets might be in the universe. The naive answer: that water has always been here, incorporated into the planet during its formation, turns out to be almost certainly wrong, or at least incomplete. Here is the problem. The region of the solar system where Earth formed was too hot. During the early period of solar system formation, the young sun was radiating enormous amounts of energy. The temperature in the inner solar system, the region where the rocky terrestrial planets formed, was high enough that volatile compounds like water, methane, and ammonia were largely in gas form rather than solid form. The boundary beyond which these compounds could condense into ice is called the frost line, or snow line, and in our early solar system it lay somewhere between 2 and 4 astronomical units from the Sun, well beyond the orbit of Mars. Inside the frost line, where Earth formed, the planetesimals that accumulated to build our planet were composed primarily of rock and metal. They contained very little water. The proto-Earth, as it accumulated from these dry building blocks, should have been a largely waterless world. And yet Earth has oceans. Vast, planet-covering oceans that contain roughly 1.4 billion cubic kilometers of water. Where did it all come from? The current scientific consensus points to 2 primary sources, working in combination. The first is comets. Comets are bodies from the outer solar system, primarily from the region beyond Neptune known as the Kuiper Belt, and from the even more distant Oort cloud, and they are largely composed of water ice mixed with rock and organic compounds. When comets were deflected into the inner solar system by gravitational perturbations, particularly during the late heavy bombardment that peaked around 4 billion years ago, they brought their water cargo with them, delivering it to the inner planets on impact. The evidence for cometary water delivery is real but complicated. Scientists can measure the ratio of different isotopes of hydrogen in water, specifically, the ratio of ordinary hydrogen to deuterium, a heavier form of hydrogen with an extra neutron. This ratio, called the D/H ratio, is slightly different in water from different parts of the solar system, because the conditions under which ice formed at different distances from the Sun affected which isotopes were incorporated. Earth's ocean water has a specific D/H ratio. The D/H ratio of water ice in comets from the Oort cloud is approximately twice Earth's ratio, which means those comets alone cannot be the primary source of Earth's water. However, comets from the Kuiper Belt have D/H ratios closer to Earth's, and some asteroid families, particularly the carbonaceous chondrite asteroids from the outer asteroid belt, have D/H ratios that match Earth's water almost exactly. This brings us to the second and currently favored primary source, water-bearing asteroids. Carbonaceous chondrite asteroids are some of the most chemically primitive objects in the solar system. They formed in the outer asteroid belt, beyond the frost line, and they contain significant quantities of water locked within their mineral structure, not as ice but chemically bound within hydrated silicate minerals. When these asteroids were delivered to the inner solar system by gravitational perturbations and struck the young Earth, the heat of impact released that chemically bound water, adding it to the growing inventory on the surface and in the atmosphere. The match between Earth's water and carbonaceous chondrite water, in terms of D/H ratios, in terms of other isotopic signatures, in terms of the ratios of noble gases dissolved in Earth's oceans, is remarkably good. Current models suggest that perhaps 80 to 90% of Earth's water was delivered by carbonaceous chondrite asteroids, with comets contributing a smaller fraction, and volcanic outgassing from Earth's interior supplying the remainder. But here is what makes this story so striking. The delivery of water to Earth was not inevitable. It required the outer solar system to be dynamically unstable in just the right way, at just the right time, to send water-bearing bodies raining inward toward the inner planets. If Jupiter's orbit had been slightly different, or the timing of the solar system's dynamical rearrangement had been slightly different, the bombardment that delivered Earth's water might have been more or less intense, earlier or later, composed of different types of bodies. Earth has oceans not because it was guaranteed to have them, but because the solar system's history conspired, through a series of contingent events, to deliver water to the right place at the right time. The first ocean was not one ocean. It was many. Initially, as the rain began to fall and the surface cooled, Water collected in low-lying topographic basins, the ancient equivalents of ocean basins, carved not by plate tectonics as the modern ocean basins are, but by the irregular surface left behind by billions of years of impact bombardment and volcanic activity. These early water bodies were separated by highlands of volcanic rock, ridges and plateaus of ancient basalt, the remnants of the solidified magma ocean. Over millions of years, as more water accumulated, both from continued rainfall and from ongoing volcanic outgassing from the interior, which released water vapor that had been trapped in the mantle, the individual water bodies grew and merged. The highlands between them were gradually eroded by the acidic rainfall. The ocean basins filled. The water level rose. By approximately 3.8 billion years ago, geological evidence suggests Earth had a global ocean, not a single continuous body of water covering the entire surface, but an interconnected system of deep ocean basins separated by volcanic island chains and the first proto-continents. The ocean was warm, perhaps 50 to 80 degrees Celsius on average, far warmer than modern oceans. It was acidic, though becoming less so as the dissolved carbon dioxide reacted with dissolved minerals and was removed from the water as carbonate deposits. It was mineral-rich, loaded with iron, sulfur, silica, and the complex cocktail of compounds that had been dissolving out of the volcanic rock for millions of years. And it was, as far as we know, completely lifeless. But the conditions that would make life possible were beginning to assemble themselves, one piece at a time. Among the most important consequences of the first ocean was its effect on Earth's atmosphere. The early Hadean atmosphere had been dominated by carbon dioxide, a potent greenhouse gas that, at the concentrations present in the Hadean, would have produced a greenhouse effect far more extreme than anything Earth experiences today. This was, paradoxically, one of the things that allowed liquid water to exist despite the fact that the young sun was significantly dimmer than it is today. A problem known as the faint young sun paradox. The paradox works like this. The sun, in its youth, was emitting approximately 70% of the energy it emits today. At that luminosity, simple calculations suggest that Earth should have been frozen solid, that the energy reaching the surface would have been insufficient to maintain liquid water. And yet the geological evidence clearly shows that liquid water existed on Earth's surface from at least 4.4 billion years ago onward. How? The answer almost certainly involves greenhouse gases. A thick atmosphere rich in carbon dioxide, and possibly methane, would have trapped enough of the sun's energy to keep the surface above freezing even with a dimmer sun. The Hadean greenhouse effect, far more powerful than the modern one, compensated for the reduced solar luminosity. But as the first ocean formed and expanded, it began to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide dissolves readily in water, forming carbonic acid. That carbonic acid reacts with dissolved calcium and magnesium ions, which were being continuously supplied to the ocean by the weathering of volcanic rock, to form carbonate minerals, calcite, dolomite, and related compounds. These carbonate minerals precipitated out of the ocean water and accumulated on the ocean floor as sediment. Carbon dioxide was being removed from the atmosphere and locked away in ocean sediment. The greenhouse effect weakened. The surface temperature slowly declined toward something closer to what we experience today. The chemistry of the atmosphere began its long, slow transformation from the toxic Hadean cocktail toward something more complex. This process, the carbonate-silicate cycle, or the geological carbon cycle, is one of the most important stabilizing feedbacks in Earth's climate system. It acts as a thermostat. When the planet warms, more water evaporates, more rainfall occurs, more rock is weathered, more carbon dioxide is drawn into the ocean, cooling the planet back down. When the planet cools, the opposite happens. The cycle has operated continuously for billions of years, preventing Earth from experiencing the runaway greenhouse that has made Venus permanently uninhabitable, and preventing the permanent global glaciation that would occur if the greenhouse effect became too weak. The first ocean did not just cover the surface with water, it began to regulate the climate. Deep beneath the surface of that first ocean, in the darkness of the ocean floor, something was happening that would prove to be one of the most consequential processes in the history of life. The ocean floor of the early Earth was not a flat, featureless plain. It was geologically active, intensely, continuously active. The thin crust beneath the ocean was being constantly generated at volcanic ridges, where magma welled up from the mantle, cooled, and spread outward. Along these ridges and at countless other points where the hot mantle rock met the cold ocean water, hydrothermal vents formed, cracks and chimneys in the ocean floor through which superheated water, laden with dissolved minerals and chemicals, vented into the cold ocean above. Modern hydrothermal vents are among the most biologically productive environments on Earth. Entire ecosystems of bacteria, tube worms, shrimp, and other organisms that derive their energy not from sunlight, but from the chemical energy in the vent fluid. They are, in a very real sense, independent of the surface world, oases of life in the deep darkness, running on chemistry rather than photosynthesis. But the vents that existed on the floor of the first ocean were operating in a world without life. What they were doing, instead, was chemistry, relentlessly, continuously, at enormous scale. There are two main types of hydrothermal vent environments that may be relevant to the origin of life. The first are the black smokers, high-temperature vents, often exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, that spew jets of superheated water blackened by sulfide minerals into the cold ocean. These vents are rich in hydrogen sulfide, methane, and metals, exactly the kind of energy-rich chemical environment that certain metabolic reactions require. The second type, and increasingly the focus of origin of life research, are the alkaline hydrothermal vents. These vents, which form through a geological process called serpentinization, are cooler than black smokers, typically between 40 and 90 degrees Celsius, and produce water that is highly alkaline and rich in hydrogen gas. The most famous modern example of this type of vent is the Lost City hydrothermal field, discovered in 2000 on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Lost City consists of towering white carbonate chimneys, some reaching 60 meters in height, continuously producing hydrogen-rich alkaline fluid. Why do alkaline hydrothermal vents matter for the origin of life? Because the chemical gradient between the alkaline, hydrogen-rich vent fluid and the acidic, carbon dioxide-rich early ocean water creates exactly the kind of proton gradient, a difference in the concentration of hydrogen ions across a membrane, that all living cells use to generate energy. Every living cell on Earth today, from bacteria to human cells, runs on proton gradients across membranes. The biochemistry of life is, at its most fundamental level, the exploitation of chemical gradients to do useful work. The alkaline hydrothermal vent hypothesis, developed by the geochemist Michael Russell and others, proposes that the first living systems arose in the micro-porous mineral structures of alkaline vents. Tiny, interconnected chambers of iron sulfide minerals that could have acted as primitive cell membranes, concentrating chemicals, maintaining chemical gradients, and allowing the first proto-metabolic reactions to run. The proton gradient generated naturally by the vent chemistry could have powered the first chemical reactions that, over vast stretches of time, became the first metabolism. This is hypothesis, not established fact. The origin of life is the deepest and most contested question in all of science. But the structure of the first ocean, its chemistry, its temperature, its acidity, and especially the hydrothermal vent systems on its floor, provided precisely the environment in which current theories suggest life might have begun. The first ocean also changed the surface of the planet in ways that reach all the way to the present. One of the most important processes it drove was the beginning of plate tectonics. The relationship between liquid water and plate tectonics is not obvious, but it is fundamental. Water acts as a lubricant for the movement of tectonic plates. It reduces the viscosity of the mantle rock, making it easier for plates to slide against each other and subduct beneath one another. Without water, the mantle becomes stiffer, plate movement becomes more difficult, and the kind of active, recycling tectonics that characterizes modern Earth becomes harder to sustain. Venus, our nearest planetary neighbor, has no ocean and no plate tectonics. Its surface is dominated by a single, rigid plate, a stagnant lid, beneath which heat from the interior builds up until it is released in catastrophic, planet-wide volcanic episodes that resurface the entire planet every few 100 million years. Venus is, in a sense, a vision of what Earth might have been without its ocean. On early Earth, the presence of water, Even the partial, early ocean of the Hadean and early Archean may have been one of the factors that allowed plate tectonics to begin and sustain itself. The subduction of water-saturated ocean crust into the mantle, one of the fundamental processes of plate tectonics, delivers water deep into the Earth's interior, where it affects the melting point and viscosity of the mantle rock in ways that feed back into the tectonics themselves. Plate tectonics, in turn, is one of the key processes that has maintained Earth's long-term habitability. It drives the carbon cycle that regulates the climate. It builds mountains, which expose fresh rock to weathering, which draws more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It creates the diverse geological environments, from deep ocean trenches to volcanic arcs to continental shelves, that provide the habitat diversity in which evolution can operate. It recycles the nutrients that life needs from the deep interior of the planet back to the surface. The first ocean did not just sit on the surface of the planet. It interacted with the planet's interior, modifying its geology, driving its tectonics, regulating its chemistry. It was not a passive feature. It was an active geological agent. There is a dimension to this story that deserves its own moment of reflection. The first ocean formed in a world that was, by any reasonable measure, hostile. The atmosphere above it was toxic. No free oxygen, no ozone layer to filter ultraviolet radiation. A sky colored by sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide that would kill any modern animal within minutes. The ocean itself was warm and acidic and mineral-laden. The ocean floor was geologically violent. The sun above was dimmer than today, and the sky offered no protection from its ultraviolet output. And yet, in this hostile, toxic, alien world, chemistry was running. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus. The 6 elements that form the backbone of all biological molecules were all present in the ocean and in the atmosphere, in various combinations, reacting with each other, driven by the energy of hydrothermal vents and ultraviolet light and lightning and the heat of the water itself. The ocean was a chemical reactor of planetary scale, and it had hundreds of millions of years in which to run its reactions. How long it took for those reactions to produce the first living thing, and exactly what that first living thing was, and exactly where and under what conditions it arose. These are questions that science has not yet fully answered. The first definitive evidence of life in the fossil record dates to approximately 3.5 billion years ago. Microbial mats and stromatolites, preserved in ancient rocks in Western Australia. Some researchers believe they have found evidence of life as early as 4.1 billion years ago, in the form of carbon isotope signatures in ancient zircon crystals from the Jack Hills. Though this evidence remains controversial, what we can say with confidence is that at some point between approximately 4 billion years ago and 3.5 billion years ago, within the first half-billion years of the first ocean's existence, life appeared. Life appeared in a toxic, acidic, lifeless ocean, on a volcanically violent planet, with a poisonous atmosphere and no ozone layer, orbiting a dimmer-than-modern sun that was bathing the surface in ultraviolet radiation. And once it appeared, it would never disappear again. The first ocean, in the largest sense, was the foundation on which everything else in the story of this planet was built. It regulated the climate through the geological carbon cycle. It drove the plate tectonics that recycled nutrients and maintained the chemical balance of the surface environment. It provided the chemical environment in which life appeared. And once life appeared in it, the ocean became the arena in which life evolved for the next 3 billion years. An almost incomprehensibly long period of biological experimentation, during which the basic biochemical machinery of life was developed, tested, refined, and diversified into forms of extraordinary complexity. Every plant, every animal, every fungus, every microbe alive today is descended from organisms that spent billions of years living in the ocean. The ocean is our ancestral home, the chemistry of our cells. The proteins, the DNA, the ADP-driven energy metabolism, the cell membranes built from phospholipids, all of it was developed in the ocean, over billions of years, before the first organism ever crawled onto land. When you drink a glass of water, you are consuming the same substance that covered this planet 4 billion years ago. When you look at the ocean today, vast blue full of life, You are looking at the direct descendant of that first dark, acidic, lifeless pool of mineral-rich water that formed when the rain finally stopped, and the surface of the early Earth was cool enough to hold it. The first ocean was not just a feature of the landscape. It was the beginning of biology. It was the beginning of the long, patient process that would eventually produce, among everything else, the species intelligent enough to look back at its own history and try to understand it. We are not yet at that species. We are not yet at animals or plants or even complex cells. We are still in the ocean of 4 billion years ago, in a world of chemistry and geology, and the first tentative molecular experiments that might, over hundreds of millions of years, give rise to something alive. But the stage is set in a way it has never been before. The ocean is here. The chemistry is running. The energy is available. The raw materials are present. The time, hundreds of millions of years of it, lies ahead. In the next episode, we turn to the moment that many scientists consider the most significant event in the history of life on Earth. A moment so improbable, so difficult to explain, so fundamental to everything that followed, that it has been called the hardest problem in all of biology. The day life appeared on Earth. Not evolved, not gradually developed, appeared. The moment when chemistry crossed the line into biology, when molecules organized themselves into something that could replicate, that could metabolize, that could change and adapt and persist. The moment when this planet, for the first time in its 4 billion year history, became alive. That story, the story of the most extraordinary transition in the history of the universe, is where we go next. Before we leave the first ocean entirely, there is one more chapter of its early story worth telling, because it is both scientifically fascinating and deeply relevant to everything that came after. The early ocean was iron-rich. Not just slightly iron-rich. Extraordinarily iron-rich, by modern standards. The ocean water of the early Archean contained dissolved iron at concentrations millions of times higher than modern seawater. The reason is straightforward. In the absence of free oxygen in the atmosphere or the ocean, iron remains soluble. Iron dissolves from the volcanic rock on the ocean floor and stays dissolved in the water, carried in solution across the entire global ocean. Modern seawater contains almost no dissolved iron. Any iron that enters the ocean today is almost immediately oxidized, combined with oxygen, and precipitates out as iron oxide minerals that sink to the ocean floor. But in the early ocean, before the great oxidation event transformed the planet's chemistry, there was no free oxygen to do this. The iron stayed in solution. This had a profound effect on the early ocean's chemistry. Iron is a critical nutrient for life. It is essential for proteins involved in electron transfer and energy metabolism. The high iron concentrations of the early ocean may have been one of the factors that supported the rapid diversification of early microbial life once it appeared. Life had access to abundant iron in a form it could easily use. The iron-rich ocean of the Archean also left behind one of the most economically important geological formations in the world, banded iron formations. These are layered sequences of iron-rich and iron-poor sedimentary rock, alternating bands of red iron oxide and gray chert, that were deposited on the ocean floor between approximately 3.8 and 1.8 billion years ago. They are found on every continent, in some of the world's oldest geological terrains, and they are the source of the vast majority of the iron ore that humans mine today, the steel in the bridge you cross, the iron in the skyscraper you work in, the rebar in the concrete beneath your feet. Most of it came from banded iron formations, from the floor of the ancient Archean Ocean, laid down by the chemistry of a world without oxygen, preserved in rock for billions of years, and eventually mined by a species that did not yet exist when those sediments were forming. The first ocean built the infrastructure of the modern industrial world, for billion years before the industrial world existed. There is a philosophical dimension to the story of the first ocean that mirrors the one we explored when discussing the Theia impact. The recurring theme of contingency and consequence, of accidents that turned out to matter enormously. The first ocean did not have to form. Earth's water came from space, delivered by comets and asteroids whose trajectories depended on the specific gravitational history of the solar system. Change the orbit of Jupiter slightly, change the timing of the late heavy bombardment, change the composition of the asteroid belt, and Earth might have received less water. Enough to have shallow lakes and rivers, but not the global ocean that covered most of the surface. Or it might have received more water. A truly ocean-covered world with no continental land masses at all, no exposed rock to weather, no silicate carbon cycle to regulate the climate. The particular quantity of water Earth received, enough to cover most of the surface but not all of it, leaving continental land masses exposed, turns out to have been important. The silicate weathering that drives the carbon cycle and regulates the long-term climate requires exposed rock in contact with rainfall. A completely ocean-covered world might have had difficulty maintaining the carbonate-silicate cycle in its most effective form. Earth received just enough water. Not too much. Not too little. Enough to cover most of the surface with ocean. Enough to allow the carbonate-silicate cycle to operate through weathering of exposed land. Enough to drive plate tectonics. Enough to provide the vast chemical reactor in which life arose. Was this fine-tuning? Was it luck? Was it inevitable given the particular conditions of our solar system? The honest answer is that we do not know. We have one example: this planet. We cannot run the experiment again with slightly different parameters. We cannot observe Earth-like planets at sufficient resolution to know how common or rare this particular combination of properties is. What we can say is that the first ocean was not a given. It was the outcome of a specific sequence of events. The death of earlier stars, the collapse of a nebula, the formation of the Sun, the accretion of planets, the migration of Jupiter, the bombardment of the inner solar system by water-bearing bodies. Each one contingent on the ones before, none of them predetermined. The first ocean was, in the deepest sense, a story of things working out. And because they worked out, because the rain fell, because the ocean formed, because the chemistry ran, because the carbon cycle stabilized the climate, because the hydrothermal vents provided the energy gradients that life would eventually exploit, we are here, on this planet, in this ocean's direct descendant, telling this story. The ocean that formed 4 billion years ago still exists. It has changed enormously. It has grown slightly as more water has been outgassed from the interior over geological time. It has changed in chemistry, from the warm, acidic, iron-rich, oxygen-free water of the Archean to the cooler, more neutral, oxygen-saturated water of today. It has been colonized by life so thoroughly that life has become one of the primary drivers of ocean chemistry. The oxygen in the modern ocean was put there by biology. The carbonate sediments on the ocean floor are largely the shells and skeletons of ancient marine organisms. The chemistry of the modern ocean is, in a profound sense, biological as much as geological. But the water molecules themselves, many of them, are ancient. They have been cycling through the ocean, the atmosphere, the land surface, and the deep interior of the Earth for billions of years. Some of the water in the modern ocean has been there, in some form, since the first rain fell on the cooling Hadean surface. It has been drunk by the first microbes, incorporated into the first cells, evaporated into the first ozone-free sky, rained back down onto the first continents, filtered through the first soils, carried by the first rivers back to the ocean. The water is as old as the planet, older in its hydrogen and oxygen atoms than the planet itself. Those atoms were forged in dying stars billions of years before Earth existed. When you look at the ocean, you are looking at the oldest continuous feature of this planet's surface. You are looking at the chemical medium in which life first appeared. You are looking at the place where 3 billion years of evolution happened before the first organism set foot on land. You are looking at the source. The first ocean changed everything. The ocean we have today is still changing everything. Still regulating the climate, still absorbing carbon dioxide, still hosting the majority of Earth's biodiversity, still driving the water cycle that makes land life possible. The rain that fell 4 billion years ago is still falling. We have now traced Earth's story from its formation as a cloud of dust and gas, through the ignition of the sun, through the violent accretion of the planet, through the Theia impact and the birth of the moon, and now through the formation of the first ocean. We have covered roughly 600 million years of Earth's history in 3 episodes, and we have not yet encountered a single living thing. That is about to change. In the next episode, we reach what may be the most astonishing single event in the entire history of this planet. An event that happened somewhere in the darkness of that early ocean, in conditions we are still working to reconstruct, through processes we do not yet fully understand. The appearance of the first living cell. Not the evolution of complexity from simpler life. Not the development of multicellular organisms from single-celled ones. Something more fundamental than either of those. The moment when chemistry, for the first time, became biology. When molecules organized themselves into a system that could reproduce itself. When the long, blind, patient work of geological chemistry crossed a threshold that it has never recrossed, and produced something new in the universe. The day life appeared on Earth. That is the next chapter, and it is the most extraordinary one we have told yet.